Frank, thanks for coming in and talking to me today. This is a series of interviews that I'm doing about history and the rewriting of history and what we do with history. And I suppose the question we might come to at the end is, what is history? But I wanted to start with your book on borders, because you talk about the past and the present and the border between the two being disintegrated, don't you? Can you tell me a bit about what you mean by that?
Well, the thing that I noticed was the way in which the boundary that separates today from yesterday, or the present from the past, has become eroded gradually. And we tend to very often have big debates and take issue with what people did 200, 300, 400 years ago. And we're increasingly living in a world where you and I and the culture that we live in gets judged or indicted in relation to what somebody, one of our ancestors or somebody did it 200, 300 years ago. So there's this kind of attempt to, in a sense, plunder history. And through the discipline of grievance architecture, you're kind of always looking for bad things that has gone on in the past and trying to use that as a way of pathologizing the present, particularly the culture of the present and the legacy of that past. So what you end up with is a situation where the past has been gradually recast along the narratives of today in such a way that it's irredeemably negative, because it doesn't stand up to the values of the people that are crusading against the past.
When did this start happening?
Well, I think there's always been a tendency. I mean, throughout human society, we always tended to rewrite the past, look for things in the past that we liked or didn't like, or we identified with. But I think what has happened is that in more recent times, particularly since the 1970s, there's been a tendency to use history as a political resource with which to make criticisms about the world in the here and now. And I think what has happened is that that tendency, which was always just a trend, nothing more than that, suddenly acquired momentum. And today, in the 21st century, it's become a very powerful force, because it is the medium through which the kind of anti-modern, anti-traditionalist, anti-conservative, anti-enlightenment and anti-Western civilization sort of ideals are best expressed. So if you want to damage and criticize the Western way of life, Western culture, Western civilization, the way you do it is not by saying that what we're doing today is irredeemably bad, but to say that essentially, we were slave owners, we were plunderers, the Industrial Revolution destroyed the environment. And if you look at children's history book today, you'll find that if you look at history books on the British past, you really don't want to be British. I mean, you just want to flee and go to another country where people weren't as horrible to the environment, weren't as horrible to the rest of the world as we English people were.
Now, absolutely, we know that it's a Western thing, don't we? And a particularly kind of Anglosphere thing. You're Hungarian? Is it creeping into other countries and cultures as well? Is this kind of, I'd call it a kind of pseudo sophistication, a kind of cultural kind of negativity? Is that moving into Hungarian culture and Middle and Eastern European cultures as well?
Well, the way you're going to look at it is that the rewriting of history books, in line with the Western, anti-Western imagination, began in California already in the early 1980s, and it kind of gradually spread to many, many parts of the Western world. And I think it's got a very powerful presence in Britain, but also in Belgium and Holland, bits of Scandinavia, and it's kind of gradually moving to Germany and Austria and other places. I think in Hungary and Poland, there's a bit of a kickback against this. So although some of the university history departments are influenced by academic history that's created here in the West, nevertheless, outside of the academy, you have a strong pushback. There's a big battle being fought, for example, in the schools. And I've gone around and I've lectured and debated and discussed with history teachers, trying to explain to them about the importance of having an open mind. You don't have to reject what's coming in from the West, but at the same time, you need to have a much more greater clarity about the importance of the legacy of Hungarian history and its meaning for today. So at the moment, I'm fairly optimistic about large parts of Eastern Europe. But I don't think there's any room for complacency, because you have to remember that Hungarian young people, watch, sort of the historical representation of the West on TV, on all the YouTube channels, on Netflix and everything else, and they're getting a very different message than they learn in schools.
Is there one thing about Western history or British history that's worse than anything else, do you think?
Worse than anything else?
Yeah.
I think that's a wrong way of posing questions, because people make decisions in light of their circumstances. And you can say that, for example, it's very regrettable that the British establishment was not sensitive enough to the Irish potato famine.
Yeah.
And you can say, for example, that very often the British establishment was far too promiscuous in the way it dealt with the East India Company in India. So I can give you many examples of where regrettable and even horrible things occurred, as they do throughout human civilization. Yeah. But you have to analyze those regrettable events, those even acts of evil that occurs in certain times, in line with the circumstances that they're in. Yeah. And it seems to me that what our job is not to kind of morally evaluate things that we're not responsible for, things that we weren't in a position to intervene in, but to understand why it was that British society behaved in the way that it did. And if you do that, then we can say the enclosure movement, for example, in Scotland, was horrible to the peasants that were kicked off the land. On the other hand, it also created the precondition for a flourishing market economy within Scotland. Yeah. So you got to balance these things out. The Industrial Revolution wasn't real fun for working class people working in the mills of Manchester, but at the same time, the Industrial Revolution created the modern world. So you got to have that kind of historical balance in the way you look at the past.
Yeah, it seems to me that the people who look at the past and weaponize the past, they'll play fast and loose with context in any kind of way, just to make the point.
It is, and I think the biggest error that is often made, not just by people that are driven by political animosity, but other people as well, is to read history backwards. Yeah. And when you read history backwards, what you're doing is you're essentially seeing what happened in 1856 in a way that is very similar to the way you would look at what's happening in London today, using the prism of the present to judge and to understand that. And if you do that, then you can never seriously understand how we became who we are, what led to the contemporary era, because there's a clear distinction between what happened before and what exists now. And we can use the past, but principally as a lesson, as a resource that we can learn a little bit more about the adventure that humanity has been through over the centuries.
It seems in a way that the disciplines seem to be disappearing, don't they? There seems to be just an overarching ideological thrust, which is interdisciplinary, I suppose, but just obliterates things. So can we get to sociology and how you started in sociology and what made you become a sociologist?
Well, I think that was an accident, because I was always interested in history. Yeah. But there was some jobs going, and I became drawn towards sociology. But sociology used to be much more sensitive to history when I got involved than it is now. And sociology was a very dynamic, open-ended subject with lots of different views, a very tolerant subject where you were allowed to have different standpoints in the way that the world worked. It gradually became zombified, so that it now is like a zombie discipline where you can tell in advance what people are going to say, and a lot of sociological research knows in advance what it's going to prove.
So it's not real research, is it? It's just asking a question with a predefined answer, and that's all it is.
Yeah, it's what we call advocacy research.
Yeah.
And I think that's terrible. I mean, obviously there are some honorable exceptions in the field, but it seems to me the big task at the moment is to ensure that the social sciences develop a much more sensitive and much more nuanced relationship to the historical evolution of our own society. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
About 15, 16 years ago, I used to love doing my Part 1 first year classes. I would do the Introduction to Sociology course. Mm-hmm. And then I noticed that the kids that were coming in to study sociology had no idea what tradition was. And they had no idea the difference between a peasant feudal society and an industrial society. In other words, they had absolutely no historical sensibility. Mm. And it became the case that I spent the first lecture telling them about the distinction between different types of societies, things that you could take for granted when I started teaching. And that indicated to me that genuine historical sensitivity and sensibility, had been disrupted in school education, but that the universities were actually complicit in reinforcing that. Yeah. So they basically almost detached themselves from the past. And insofar as we talked about the past, it was always through a very negative orientation, a very kind of, almost like a horror story, endless horror story, that was there before we got to our own sensitive, sensible ways.
Can you envisage a change? Can you envisage history being mobilized in a more positive kind of way to help understanding in different contexts, or not? Are we beyond that now?
Well, we're beyond in the sense that if you rely on the existing institutions, they're not going to suddenly reform themselves. No. And I think that's a big problem, because unless we understand our own history, where we come from, it's very difficult to know exactly where we're going to go, who we are and what we're about. But I'm not entirely pessimistic, because I think there are people I know, and myself included, who are committed to rescuing history from the way it's being plundered at the present. But that requires the creation of new institutions, new organizations. That requires that there are more people like us who are engaging particularly with 15, 16, 17-year-old kids, getting them to understand where they come from, maybe even instilling pride. One of the projects I was thinking about, and I'm the last person that should be doing it, because I'm not, I wasn't born in this country. I've got this fantasy of writing a book, about why we should be proud of, in praise of Britain, basically, which would look at the history and not in a one-sided way, and just simply ignore many of the bad things that occurred in the past, but basically to demonstrate to a new audience that the British experiment, the British way of life, is actually, for all its sins, far more important than we could credit for. Actually, Britishness and British values have made an enormous contribution to the world. Yeah. And I think that people just simply don't understand that. If they don't understand that, then they're really missing out a lot about the experience of humanity.
It's a force for good, generally.
On balance,
yeah,
absolutely.
On balance, yeah. I just as you're talking about that, and you're talking about the institutions, and well, you're saying, okay, we need new institutions, and I would absolutely agree with you, certainly in terms of education. We need to look at things differently. But within the institutions we've got, I think one of the key problems is freedom of expression and freedom of speech. Would you agree with that? And could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a very powerful groupthink. Yeah. And there's a very powerful mood of conformism. And it means that even young scholars who are really quite bright, quite intelligent, know what the score is, often feel scared to voice their opinions. They really watch their words. So the university has become almost like a feudal monastery where there's only one narrative that's around, and that's it. And I think that basically inhibits people from challenging and doing. There's a minority that's against that.
But I would say we really are a minority.
A real man, and often get emails. I mean, I got an email last week from somebody from a Welsh university in Aberystwyth, and she was saying that she doesn't know what to do because, she wants to do good. She wants to teach her subject in line with her understanding of what happened in the past, understanding what's going on now. But she feels that because she still hasn't got a kind of a full, stable position, that if she opened her mouth, she'd be ostracized and would be fired. And I think that there are a lot of people like that.
I think there are lots and lots of people like that. I think the sector generally is very much like that. I'm interested. You're saying those things, and lots of things are coming into my mind. One of the things I'm interested in is this idea of an ethical position, because our view of history and our view of the social sciences and the arts is absolutely bound up with this idea of doing good, isn't it? And an ethical position, an ethical look on the past. How is that bound up with ideology, do you think?
Well, I think that I'm not a fan of ethics in the way that it's promoted now.
Yeah.
I think ethics has fundamentally altered from its original Greek meaning.
Yeah.
And since the 1970s, it's become entirely utilitarian. And I think that ethical positions are used in a very promiscuous way as a way of justifying what you're doing. So what is now ethical are the values and the outlooks that you uphold. And if, for example, if I like eating meat and I not just like it, but really enjoy it, and I make no concessions for vegan January or whatever, which is meant to be a very ethical moment, then somehow I've kind of committed a cultural crime. So the way that I look at it is that ethics has been completely perverted to having this shallow, conformist outlook that somehow tries to guilt trip people that have a viewpoint that's different to yours. It's got nothing to do with ethics in the way that Aristotle and others used to talk about it.
So this idea, you mentioned guilt, and I can't help but think of fear as well, which you've also written about, haven't you? You've written a book about fear. Can you kind of talk a little bit about how fear works in this context, this idea of, where we work, how we socialize, how fear kind of keeps us in boxes?
I think one of the things that cancel culture has done is it created and institutionalized what in sociology we call cultural distancing.
Yeah.
What cultural distancing means is that we have to watch how we behave to one another. There's all these processes and rules and regulation at work, which basically tells you cannot touch somebody, you cannot have a drink with people who are, your bosses or work below you. You have to watch how you, the kind of sexual relationship you have with your workmates. Particularly, you have to watch your words and be careful not to offend somebody. And even if you offend somebody inadvertently, unwittingly, because you don't mean to offend them, it's still seen as a cause for offense. So when you have this kind of cultural distancing process, you become, to some extent, wary of being yourself. And you become wary of what we used to call spontaneous relationships taken for granted. Where you and I kind of wink at each other and we know exactly what we're thinking. Where I make a joke at your expense, and I know that you're not going to think that I've annihilated your identity.
In a way, that can make us closer, can't it?
It totally does, yeah.
If you feel as though you're comfortable enough with me to make a joke at my expense, and you know how far to go without devastating my ego, then there's something there which we're really losing in society, aren't we?
Yeah, we're losing this kind of bond of taking for granted trust, which is a very important element in our relationships, where we know that with some people who are part of this circle of trust, we can be ourselves in a way that we cannot with other people. And that's really important. Because when you're able to be yourself and to be more open to your thoughts and to express your kind of hopes and your aspirations and your fears,
Yeah.
then it does make it easier for you to engage with the problems of life. But if you're distanced from one another, you become more isolated. The more isolated you become, the more fearful you become, the more anxious you become about how people are looking at you, what's really kind of going on. And when you begin to dissolve that contact, essential contact that used to be part of the workplace experience, for example, then it does inhibit and devalue the quality of your work life.
And you can feel that all around. You can feel it when you're in the streets now more than ever, of course, when we're all masked up and all the rest of it. I'm just interested in all of these things that we're talking about, and they're all linked in some kind of way, I think. There's this idea of subjectivity comes up quite a lot, doesn't it? And this idea of, if I look at you in a certain way, then you feel as though I'm insulting you, and then you can go and tell someone, and your subjective experience, your lived experience, trumps everything. Are there ways in which, well, I've probably just given an example there, but can you think of any other examples of the ways in which the idea of subjectivity is being weaponized?
Yeah, when you call it subjectivity, I call it more identity.
Yeah.
Because I think if you become obsessed with ourselves, as we're encouraged to do, and we've embraced a kind of psychological interpretation of our world, then our social relations or other kind of values become, in a sense, less important.
Yeah.
And the more we become self-oriented, the more obsessed we become with our identity. And our identity becomes everything. So at that point in life, I don't just have sex with another man, I'm now gay. And I'm not just gay, but gay means being a lifestyle. And I just have a lifestyle. But if it's
a politics.
As the politics, it becomes really politicized. So when your identity, and that goes for everybody, trans people, women, ethnic minorities, even working class people are now obsessed with their identity. When that becomes so important, then what you end up doing is living a world where the slightest criticism that you receive is seen as representing the annihilation of your identity.
Yeah.
And you genuinely do become offended to the point at which you feel, I must do something about this. I must report you, or must find ways of kind of punishing you.
Yeah.
And this relates back to the beginning of our discussion, which is to do with history.
Yeah.
Which is increasingly our individual personal identities are legitimated by the past, are legitimated by something that may or may not have happened in the past. So that's why you will, if you're a woman, you want to have what's happened to all the women scientists in the 16th century. And why aren't there more women composers, in the Middle Ages, and you begin to look for these hidden women philosophers. And if you don't find them, you begin to invent non-existent women philosophers or non-existent, black, classical pianist in Baroque Europe. And by doing that, what you really become involved in is this almost kind of very personal, subjectively led desire to forge your identity in relation to the legitimation that the past gives you. I think the best example of that is the Fall Roads campaign, where a lot of students in Oxford are saying, every time I walk past the statue, I feel traumatized. I feel psychologically disoriented. Yeah. And that kind of performance of vulnerability or fragility.
It's performative.
It becomes part of the territory.
Yeah. There's something else that occurs to me as you're talking about that. And this idea of identity and identity groups and the smaller, the more specific the identity group, the better. There's something about the past, isn't there, that's being eroded, and that's the centre. That's the kind of the conservative mainstream. We're both academics, and we're interested in an academic appreciation of the past. But you don't get academic appreciations of the conservative mainstream anymore, do you? You don't get the grand narrative. It's all about these kind of micro narratives. We're losing something, aren't we, of our identity, which is central as opposed to peripheral.
We are, and it isn't just simply what you call the considered central. It's even the old European ideal universalism.
Yeah.
Which was central to the Enlightenment, it was central to Christianity.
It's a dirty word now, universalism.
It is. And one of the distinguishing features of Western culture from all the others was this appreciation of a universal sensibility and the fact that we are able to transcend at times our specific circumstances. And there's something quite magical that binds us together as human beings, which is then torn asunder by the fact that I've got nothing in common with that identity group, sort of, or the difference between us is more important than what we have in common.
Than what brings us together.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you had to kind of describe to me what history is as a concept for us, how would you do it?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about history as a discipline, history as something that is part of our legacy. I mean, there's different ways of looking at it.
An understanding of the past, not just the past, a construction of the past.
I think that there are two elements. One of the elements is understanding the past through appreciating and evaluating the legacy that it has brought us.
Yeah.
Appreciating doesn't mean to say that you uncritically just embrace the past, because you got to, sort of understand its strengths and its weaknesses, the bits that you really want to celebrate, the bits that you want to leave behind. But essentially, the past gives us a kind of an understanding of what is distinct about the present, what is distinct about us. And for me, what I love about history is it tells me what's special about our own world, right? As opposed to my opponents who see the world as not distinct, but just a continuation of what has gone on, more or less the last chapter in a story that began a long time ago. Yeah. So I think that's really quite important. I think that sort of without history, we simply do not understand, what we're about. So every time I'm at a loss to make sense of something, every time I feel a bit disoriented that I don't quite capture what's really happening here and there, I find nothing better than to look at history, understand the context, the origins, try to make sense. So one of my obsessions is, as I continually go between the present and the past, I go back and forth. Yeah. And the more I go back and forth, the sharper is my clarity about what's happening in the here and now.
If, just to go back to something we were talking about, this idea of new institutions or new ways of learning or new places to learn, in reality, what do you think we could do?
Well, I think that several things, but I think the bottom line is that we need to establish new schools. We have to establish new universities. We have to establish a stronger presence in the media. I mean, I'm glad that we're now beginning to get a couple of media outlets that are on the right side, on the right page. But there's a long, long, long way to go. And it seems to me that, we just need to create what I see as being a counterintelligentsia. We need to create an intellectual milieu that is countercultural. Because everything that we have to stand up for goes against the grain of contemporary culture. So we have to have a countercultural intelligentsia that is prepared to stand up and provide an alternative view of the world to what they see on TV or what they hear on the radio. And I think that's a doable thing. There's a lot of people I know.
It's happening, isn't it?
It's happening here and there. I just think we shouldn't be complacent because we're up against some formidable institutions. But I do think that a bit of courage and a bit of optimism can go a long way in terms of challenging these things. And going back to Hungary, one of the good things about Hungary that I quite like is that they are now beginning, I think the government has realized there that unless they begin to train and educate a counterintelligentsia to the,
and they're investing in that massively.
You've got to invest in that. Otherwise, you're going to have a situation where you're going to be undermined by, sort of the academic culture that is imported from the West. And I think that is a really significant and a very important thing to do. And we've got to do something like that here as well.
Yeah, so the idea of investment and not just cultural or intellectual investment,
it is,
but money.
But even I mean, I'm involved with this initiative called the Freedom Schools, where we organize these 2-3 day sort of discussions for people between the age of 16 and 24, the really important ones, because they're the future. And basically what we do is we argue and debate and try to basically explain to them there's more than one way of skinning a cat, there's more than one way of looking at the world.
Yeah. Well, that sounds to me a positive note to end on. Frank, thanks very much.
Pleasure.
Great.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.